Good evening, and welcome to Bedtime Biographies. Before we begin with our story, if you would like, you are welcome to leave a comment letting us know where in the world you are listening from tonight, or which historical life you would like us to sit with next. If these stories help you rest, subscribing is a simple way to help more people find them. Now, let us settle in. There is a portrait that hangs in the National Portrait Gallery in London, a single composite image created centuries after the fact, showing 6 women in a row. Most people who pass it know the shape of the story before they read a single label. Divorced, beheaded, died. Divorced, beheaded, survived. It is one of the most repeated sentences in English history, a rhyme taught to children, a joke told at dinner parties, a shorthand so familiar that it has almost stopped meaning anything at all. But a rhyme is not a life. 6 women were married to the same man across nearly 40 years of English history, and each of them arrived at that marriage from a completely different direction, carrying a different set of expectations, a different education, a different homeland or household, a different private hope for what her life might become. Some of them never met each other. One of them almost certainly never wanted to be queen at all. At least one entered the marriage already, grieving something else entirely. Tonight is not really a story about Henry VIII, although he moves through every part of it, the way weather moves through a landscape. Tonight is about 6 lives that are usually flattened into a single sentence, and what happens when we slow down enough to see each of them as a person first, and a wife to a king second. The first of them arrived in England as a teenager, from a country she had never seen full, to marry a prince she had barely met. And by the time her story ends, she will have outlasted almost everyone who welcomed her. Let us begin with her. Catherine of Aragon was born in the closing weeks of 1485 in the Castilian town of Alcalá de Henares, the youngest surviving child of 2 of the most formidable rulers in Europe. Her mother was Isabella of Castile. Her father was Ferdinand of Aragon. Together they had spent years pressing the final Muslim kingdom on the Iberian Peninsula, the Emirate of Granada, toward its end, a campaign that would conclude successfully only a few years after Catherine's birth. She grew up, in other words, inside a household that understood war, negotiation, and the slow, patient construction of power as ordinary facts of daily life. It would be easy to imagine a childhood like that, as cold or distant, arranged entirely around statecraft. The reality, as far as historians can reconstruct it, was more layered than that. Isabella took an active interest in the education of her daughters, and Catherine grew up literate in Latin, trained in theology, music and needlework, and raised within a court that valued religious devotion as something serious rather than merely decorative. She was said, later in life, to have kept these habits with her for decades. Long after she left Spain, people who knew her would describe a woman who prayed with real discipline, who fasted according to the rhythms of the church calendar, who sewed her husband's shirts herself, even after she had become queen of another country entirely. She was still a small child when the marriage that would define her life was first proposed. Political marriages of this era were rarely about the 2 young people at the center of them. They were instruments meant to bind 2 royal houses together against the shifting alliances of the age. In this case, the goal was to connect the Spanish crown with the Tudor dynasty of England, a family that had only recently and rather unsteadily claimed the English throne after decades of civil war. A formal arrangement was reached when Catherine was still a child, promising her in marriage to Arthur, Prince of Wales, the elder son and heir of King Henry VII. For years, this marriage existed mostly on paper, exchanged through ambassadors and treaties, while Catherine continued her education in Spain. She did not travel to England until 1501, when she was 15 years old. The crossing itself was difficult. Her ships were driven back by storms more than once, before she finally reached English shores that autumn, arriving in a country whose language she barely spoke. To marry a young man she had never actually met in person until shortly before the wedding. Arthur was 16. Contemporary accounts describe him as intelligent and studious, if physically frail, a boy who had been raised almost from birth for the specific purpose of inheriting the English crown. The wedding took place in November of 1501 at St. Paul's Cathedral, an event staged with enormous ceremony intended to demonstrate to all of Europe that the Tudor dynasty had arrived as a serious and permanent royal house. For a young woman who had crossed an ocean and a language barrier to reach this moment, it must have represented both an ending and a beginning, the completion of a plan that had shaped her entire childhood. It lasted 5 months. By the spring of 1502, both Arthur and Catherine had fallen seriously ill, very likely with what contemporaries called the sweating sickness, a mysterious and frequently fatal illness that periodically swept through England during this period. Catherine recovered. Arthur did not. He died in April 1502 at Ludlow Castle, leaving behind a 15-year-old widow, a grieving royal family, and an urgent and uncomfortable political problem. What was to be done with Catherine now? She was still, technically, a valuable political asset, the daughter of two of the most powerful monarchs in Europe, and her dowry had not been fully paid. Rather than send her home and unravel the alliance entirely, King Henry VII proposed a solution that would eventually cause enormous consequences decades later. Catherine would instead marry Arthur's younger brother, the new heir to the throne, a boy who was at that time only 11 years old. His name was Henry. The arrangement required a special dispensation from the Pope, because canon law generally forbade marriage to a brother's widow. Catherine would later insist, for the rest of her life, that her marriage to Arthur had never been consummated, that she had come to her second husband as a virgin in every meaningful sense, a claim that would eventually become one of the most consequential legal and theological arguments in English history. At the time, however, it was simply one clause in a complicated negotiation between two royal families, trying to salvage an expensive alliance. For the next several years, Catherine's position in England was strange and uncertain. The betrothal to young Henry was arranged, then quietly cast into doubt, then left unresolved for years at a time, as the political winds between England and Spain shifted. She lived in England during this period in a state of genuine financial hardship. Her father was slow to pay the remaining dowry. Her father-in-law, increasingly frugal and suspicious in his later years, was reluctant to fully support a daughter-in-law whose usefulness to the crown remained unclear. Letters from this period, both her own and those written about her, describe genuine money troubles, unpaid servants, and a young woman essentially waiting in a foreign country to learn what would become of her life. It would be difficult to overstate how strange this period must have been to live through. She was a princess in name, but without a settled household of her own income. She was betrothed, but not married, to a boy several years younger than herself. She was, in a sense, suspended between two lives, unable to fully return to Spain and unable to fully begin the future she had been promised. Everything changed in April 1509, when Henry VII died and his son ascended to the throne as King Henry VIII. Almost immediately, the new king chose to proceed with the long-delayed marriage. Catherine and Henry were married quietly in June 1509, only weeks after his coronation, and then crowned together in a joint ceremony shortly afterward. Whatever political calculation had originally shaped this match, it does not appear to have been without genuine warmth. Contemporary accounts describe the early years of the marriage as affectionate. Henry was 18, athletic, well-educated, and by most accounts genuinely fond of his new wife, who was 6 years his senior, well-read, and experienced in exactly the kind of diplomatic and religious formality that court life demanded. For a time, Catherine occupied a role in English political life that went well beyond ceremonial queenship. She had been raised, after all, by a mother who had ridden with armies and directly overseen matters of state. In 1513, while Henry was away in France pursuing a military campaign, Catherine was left as regent of England, and when a Scottish army invaded northern England that same year, it was under her authority that English forces were organised to meet them. The resulting English victory at the Battle of Flodden, in which the Scottish king himself was killed, took place while Catherine held the reins of government. She is said to have taken a serious interest in provisioning the army and considered, according to some accounts, addressing the troops in person before their departure north. Whatever the precise details, her regency stands as one of the more striking demonstrations of trust and capability granted to any of Henry's queens. A piece of the story often lost beneath the more famous ending that would come later. But the years that followed brought a difficulty that would eventually become the central crisis of Catherine's entire life. She and Henry conceived several children together in the early years of their marriage. Almost all of them either were stillborn or did not survive infancy. Only one child lived into adulthood, a daughter born in 1516 named Mary. For a king in this period, the absence of a surviving son was not simply a private sorrow. It was understood by nearly everyone at court as a genuine crisis of state. England had endured decades of civil war within living memory, largely because of unclear or disputed succession, and the idea of a female heir inheriting the throne outright was, in the political imagination of the time, considered fragile at best and disastrous at worst. As the 1520s progressed, and it became increasingly clear that Catherine, now well into her 40s, was unlikely to bear another child, the question of succession began to weigh on Henry with growing urgency. It is worth pausing here to notice something. The popular telling of this story usually skips past entirely. For the first 2 decades of their marriage, this was, by most surviving evidence, a partnership rather than merely an arrangement. Henry publicly praised Catherine's judgment. He trusted her with the government of the realm in his absence. Ambassadors described genuine affection between them well into the 1520s. This was not a cold transaction that abruptly turned into betrayal. It was a marriage that had endured real years, real crises, real shared grief over the children they had lost, before it began, slowly and then decisively, to come apart. What eventually pulled it apart was not simply the absence of a son. It was the arrival of a particular woman at court, a woman whose personality was almost the opposite of Catherine's in nearly every visible way, and whose presence would eventually force open one of the most consequential religious and political ruptures in English history. Her name was Anne Boleyn, and the manner in which she entered Henry's life reveals a great deal about both of them. Anne had spent much of her adolescence abroad, first briefly at the court of the Habsburg regent in the Netherlands, and then for several formative years at the French royal court, where she absorbed a style of wit, fashion, and conversation that was considered notably more sophisticated and continental than anything typical of the English nobility at the time. She returned to England around 1522, in her early 20s, already possessing a reputation for sharp intelligence and confident conversation that set her apart from many of the women around her. Her older sister, Mary Boleyn, had already been one of Henry's mistresses for a period of time, a fact that would later carry its own theological complications. Anne, however, appears to have taken a markedly different approach. According to the surviving evidence, she declined to become merely another mistress, resisting Henry's advances even as his interest intensified across the mid-1520s. Whether this resistance came from calculated ambition, genuine principle, family strategy, or some combination of the three remains debated among historians, and the truth is probably not reducible to any single motive. What is clear is that her refusal appears to have deepened Henry's determination rather than discouraged it. By 1527, Henry had become convinced, or had convinced himself, that his marriage to Catherine had never been valid in the eyes of God. He fixed upon a passage from the book of Leviticus, which pronounces a curse of childlessness upon a man who marries his brother's wife, and began to argue that his lack of a surviving son was in fact divine punishment for the very marriage he had entered into more than 15 years earlier. This theological argument, whatever its sincerity, conveniently also cleared a path toward a new marriage, and Henry began pursuing an annulment through the Pope with a determination that would eventually consume years of diplomatic effort and reshape the religious life of an entire nation. Catherine's response to this campaign reveals, more clearly than almost anything else in her life, the woman her early education had shaped her into becoming. She refused, entirely and permanently, to accept the premise that her marriage had never been valid. She maintained, with what observers on both sides described as unwavering conviction, that her first marriage to Arthur had never been consummated, and that her marriage to Henry was therefore legitimate in every sense that mattered under church law. This was not a position she adopted for convenience. She held to it with a consistency that never wavered, through years of mounting pressure, isolation, and personal loss, until her death. The dispute that followed, often remembered simply as the king's great matter, would eventually take years to resolve and would ultimately reshape the religious structure of the entire country. But before we follow that story to its consequences, it is worth returning to the woman at its center, because what happened to Catherine during these years reveals something the standard summary of her life rarely captures. In the years between 1527 and 1533, while ambassadors and theologians argued over the legitimacy of her marriage, Catherine's daily life did not stop. She continued to appear at court functions when required. She continued to oversee her household. She continued, by multiple accounts, to sew and to pray with the same discipline she had practiced since childhood. But underneath this steady surface, the pressure on her was extraordinary. Cardinal Wolsey, Henry's chief minister, was tasked with securing an annulment from Rome, and when a legatine court was finally convened at Blackfriars in London in the summer of 1529 to examine the matter, Catherine was given the chance to speak. What she did in that courtroom has become one of the more quietly remarkable moments in English royal history. Rather than address the assembled judges, she crossed the room, knelt before Henry himself in front of the entire court, and asked him directly what she had done to offend him, reminding him that she had come to him as a virgin, that she had been a loyal and obedient wife for 20 years, and that she would submit to the judgment of impartial arbiters rather than a court she believed to be biased against her from the outset. Having said this, she rose, and in a gesture contemporaries found almost as striking as her words, she walked out of the room entirely, ignoring the officials who called her back. The court proceeded without her, but the moment had already made clear that Catherine did not intend to make this easy, and would not simply accept a quiet dissolution of her marriage for the sake of political convenience. The case dragged on. Rome, for a mixture of theological and political reasons, including the fact that Catherine's nephew, the immensely powerful Holy Roman Emperor Charles V, had effectively controlled the city where the Pope resided since his armies had sacked it 2 years earlier, was in no hurry to grant Henry the annulment he wanted. Frustrated by years of delay, Henry began to pursue an entirely different solution, one that would ultimately outlast Catherine, outlast Anne, and reshape the religious identity of England for centuries afterward. If the Pope would not grant the annulment, Henry would simply remove the Pope's authority over the matter altogether. This is the point at which Catherine's personal story becomes inseparable from a genuine constitutional transformation. Through a series of parliamentary acts passed in the early 1530s, Henry's government asserted that the king, not the Pope, was the supreme head of the Church in England. This was not merely a legal technicality invented to solve one marriage. It permanently altered the structure of English religious and political life, severing centuries of connection to Rome and setting England on a path toward Protestant reform that would, in various forms, continue for generations. Catherine's refusal to accept an annulment had, indirectly and unintentionally, become one of the pressures that helped push an entire nation into religious schism. In January 1533, while the legal situation was still technically unresolved, Henry married Anne Boleyn in a secret ceremony, apparently already aware that Anne was pregnant. A few months later, Thomas Cranmer, the newly appointed Archbishop of Canterbury, formally declared Henry's marriage to Catherine invalid and the marriage to Anne valid. And in September of that year, Anne gave birth not to the son Henry had hoped for, but to a daughter who would grow up to become one of the most consequential monarchs in English history, Elizabeth. Catherine, meanwhile, was informed that she was no longer queen. She was to be known instead as Princess Dowager of Wales, a title that quietly denied her marriage to Henry had ever legally existed, treating her instead as though she had only ever been the widow of his brother Arthur. She refused for the rest of her life to accept this title or to answer to it. Her household was reduced. She was moved between a series of increasingly remote and uncomfortable residences, eventually settling at Kimbolton Castle in Huntingdonshire, a cold, damp, moated house far from London and the court she had once helped govern. Her separation from her daughter Mary during this period was, by most accounts, the deepest wound of her final years. Henry, likely concerned that mother and daughter together might form a focus of opposition to his new marriage, forbade them from seeing one another. Letters survive from Catherine during this time, written to Mary with visible tenderness, urging her daughter to remain patient, obedient, and firm in her faith, even as both of them were kept apart by royal command. Catherine also continued to write to Henry himself in these final years, and the tone of these letters is worth noticing because it is not simply bitter. She continued, even in her reduced and isolated circumstances, to address him with a kind of formal warmth, still signing herself, in at least one surviving letter, as his loyal wife, still expressing concern for his well-being, even as her own health and situation deteriorated. She died at Kimbleton in January 1536 at the age of 50. The cause is generally believed by modern historians to have been cancer, likely of the heart or nearby tissue, though contemporary medicine had no real vocabulary for such a diagnosis. In her final days, she is said to have dictated one last letter to Henry, in which she forgave him, expressed continued concern for his soul, asked him to be a good father to their daughter, and signed it, according to tradition, Catherine the Queen. Whether every detail of this final letter survives in its original form is debated among historians, but the broad content is well attested, and it captures something essential about the woman who had crossed the sea from Spain as a 15-year-old girl and ended her life, more than 3 decades later, still insisting on the validity of a marriage the rest of the country had been told to forget. When news of her death reached the English court, Henry and Anne are both reported to have reacted with visible relief rather than grief, dressing in yellow, a colour sometimes associated at the time with celebration rather than mourning, though some historians note that yellow was also a colour of mourning in Spain, leaving the true meaning of this choice genuinely uncertain. Catherine was buried at Peterborough Cathedral, not with the full honours of a queen, but with those of a princess dowager, the title she had refused in life ever to accept. It would be easy to let her story end there, in that cold cathedral, with a title she rejected carved above her tomb. But it is worth pausing on one particular fact, because it complicates the flattened rhyme most people carry with them. Of all 6 women who would eventually marry Henry, Catherine was the one who resisted him most completely, who never surrendered her own account of her own life, and who arguably shaped the future of the English monarchy more permanently than almost anyone else in this story. Not through submission, but through refusal. Her daughter Mary would one day become queen in her own right, the first woman to successfully claim the English throne outright, in part because Catherine had spent decades insisting, against enormous pressure, that Mary's legitimacy could never honestly be erased. While Catherine lived out these final years in isolation, the woman who had replaced her was discovering that winning a king's determination and keeping it were 2 very different accomplishments. Anne Boleyn's rise to the position Catherine had once held was, in its own way, just as improbable as Catherine's original journey from Spain. She had not been born to expect a crown. Her father, Thomas Boleyn, was an ambitious and capable courtier, but the Boleyns were a family of relatively recent nobility, risen through trade and advantageous marriages rather than ancient royal blood. Anne's route to the throne was built almost entirely on her own qualities. Her education, her wit, her presence, and the particular kind of confidence that her years at the French court had given her, a confidence that many English observers found either captivating or unsettling, depending on where their loyalties lay. She was born sometime between 1501 and 1507. Historians continue to debate the exact year at Blickling Hall, or possibly Hever Castle, in Kent, into a family that valued education for its daughters more than many of their peers. She was sent abroad while still quite young, first to the court of Margaret of Austria in the Netherlands, and then to the French royal court, where she remained for roughly 7 years, serving in the household of Queen Claude. By the time she returned to England in the early 1520s, she had absorbed not only fluent French, but an entire manner of court behavior, dress, and conversation that set her apart. Contemporary accounts describe her less in terms of conventional beauty and more in terms of magnetism. She was known for her dark eyes, her expressive presence, her skill in dancing and music, and above all, her sharp and quick tongue, a trait that some at court admired and others distrusted deeply. Her first serious romantic entanglement in England appears to have been with Henry Percy, heir to the Earl of Northumberland, a match that was ultimately broken off under pressure from Cardinal Wolsey, likely because Percy was already contracted to marry someone else, and possibly because Wolsey judged the match unsuitable for other political reasons. Anne is said to have blamed Wolsey personally for this disappointment, a grievance that would later have real consequences once she gained influence over Henry. When Henry's interest in Anne intensified in the mid-1520s, she made a decision that distinguished her sharply from her own sister, who had already been one of Henry's mistresses. Anne refused to become merely another passing affair. The surviving letters from Henry to Anne during this courtship, several of which still exist in the Vatican archives today, having been seized at some point after the relationship became public knowledge, reveal a man writing with genuine longing and frustration, describing himself as caught between hope and uncertainty, complaining of the pain of being separated from her, and addressing her with a warmth that suggests real emotional investment rather than simple calculation. It is worth pausing here on something the standard version of this story often compresses into a single sentence. This courtship lasted roughly 7 years. Anne did not simply appear at court and immediately become queen. She spent the better part of a decade in an uncertain, protracted, and increasingly public position, watching Henry pursue an annulment that seemed perpetually out of reach, aware that her own reputation was being damaged by rumors and gossip, even as she waited, unable to fully claim the position she was being promised, and unable to retreat from it either. Whatever ambition or genuine affection drove her forward, this was not an easy or comfortable period of waiting. It required a particular kind of nerve to sustain. By the time she and Henry finally married in January of 1533, in a secret ceremony conducted before the annulment from Catherine had even been formally completed, Anne was already pregnant. This detail mattered enormously because it meant the marriage needed rapid legal validation, adding urgency to Cranmer's formal declaration a few months later that Henry's marriage to Catherine had never been valid. Anne was crowned queen in June 1533 in a lavish ceremony along the Thames and through the streets of London, though contemporary reports suggest the crowds that watched her procession were notably subdued, a reflection of how unpopular the entire situation remained with much of the English public, many of whom still regarded Catherine as the rightful queen. 3 months later, in September 1533, Anne gave birth to a daughter. The child was healthy and would grow up to become Elizabeth I, one of the most consequential monarchs in English history. But at the time, her birth was received by Henry and his court with something closer to disappointment than celebration. A document had already been prepared announcing the birth of a prince, and the letter S had to be hastily added to make it read princess instead. For a marriage built almost entirely around the promise of a male heir, the arrival of a daughter, however remarkable that daughter would eventually prove to be, was not the outcome anyone at court had been led to expect. The years that followed placed Anne in an increasingly precarious position, one that reveals something important about the entire structure of what it meant to be Henry's queen. She had won this position through refusal, through insisting on marriage rather than mistresshood, through outlasting years of uncertain courtship. But having won it, she now faced the same fundamental requirement that had doomed Catherine's marriage, the production of a surviving male heir. And she faced it with far less security than Catherine had ever possessed. Catherine had been the daughter of two of the most powerful monarchs in Europe. Anne had no such protective status. Her position rested entirely on Henry's continued favor and on her ability to deliver what the entire kingdom was waiting for. Anne became pregnant again in 1534, but that pregnancy ended in miscarriage or stillbirth. The exact details are not entirely clear from surviving records. She conceived once more in early 1536, but in January of that year, only days after Catherine of Aragon's death, Anne miscarried a fetus that appeared, according to some accounts, to have been male. This loss, arriving at almost precisely the moment when Henry might have felt free to consider the marriage a fresh start following Catherine's death, appears to have been the turning point after which Henry's affection for Anne curdled into something closer to active hostility. It is worth noting here how tightly interwoven Catherine's and Anne's fates ultimately were, despite the two women almost certainly never meeting after Anne's rise to prominence. Catherine's death in January 1536 removed the one obstacle that had made Anne's own marriage legally complicated, since as long as Catherine lived, questions could theoretically be raised about whether Henry's marriage to Anne was truly valid. And yet, within 4 months of Catherine's death, Anne herself would be dead as well, the victim of a fall from favor, even swifter and more brutal than the slow decline Catherine had endured over the better part of a decade. The exact origins of the accusations brought against Anne in the spring of 1536 remain genuinely debated among historians. What is documented is the sequence of events. In late April, a court musician named Mark Smeaton was arrested and, under what appears to have been considerable pressure, confessed to having committed adultery with the Queen. Within days, several other men, including the courtier Henry Norris, and most shockingly to contemporaries, Anne's own brother George Boleyn, were arrested on charges of adultery with the Queen, and in George's case, incest as well. Anne herself was arrested on the 2nd of May, taken by barge to the Tower of London, the same fortress where she had stayed in comfort and celebration only 3 years earlier, before her coronation. The trial that followed lasted only a matter of days. The evidence presented against her, by the standards of any fair legal process, was thin and largely circumstantial, resting heavily on the coerced confession of Smeaton and testimony that most modern historians regard as unreliable or politically manufactured. Whether the charges were entirely fabricated from the outset, or whether they represented an opportunistic prosecution built around genuine court gossip and rivalry, remains a subject of ongoing historical debate. What can be said with confidence is that the speed and severity of the process, from arrest to trial to conviction in barely more than 2 weeks, was extraordinary, even by the standards of Tudor justice, and strongly suggests that Henry had already decided the outcome before the trial began. Anne was found guilty on the 15th of May, 1536, and sentenced to death. Her own uncle, the Duke of Norfolk, presided over the court that condemned her, a detail that speaks to how thoroughly the machinery of the Tudor state could turn against even its own family members when the king's will demanded it. 5 of the men accused alongside her, including her brother George, were executed on Tower Hill 2 days before her own death. Anne herself was executed on the 19th of May within the walls of the Tower, a location chosen deliberately to spare the wider public spectacle that a public execution would have entailed. In one detail that has struck historians ever since, Henry arranged for a swordsman to be brought specially from Calais to carry out the execution, rather than using the traditional English axe. A sword required greater skill and was widely regarded as a swifter, more merciful method of execution, and its use for Anne has sometimes been read as a final, strange gesture of consideration from a man who had, in every other respect, orchestrated her destruction. Contemporary accounts describe Anne as composed in her final hours, delivering a short speech from the scaffold in which she asked the crowd to pray for the king, describing him, according to the conventions of the time, as a good and gentle prince, words that were likely required by the circumstances of a public execution, rather than a genuine reflection of her private feelings. She was buried in an unmarked grave within the chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula, inside the Tower grounds, without a coffin, in an arrow chest that happened to be available. It would be well over 2 centuries before her resting place was properly identified and marked. The woman who had waited 7 years to become queen, who had reshaped the religious structure of an entire nation through the simple act of refusing to become anything less than a wife, had held the crown for barely 3 years before losing both it and her life. What remains most striking about Anne's story, when set beside Catherine's, is how differently the same fundamental pressure destroyed them both. Catherine was undone slowly, over the better part of a decade, through legal maneuvering, isolation, and a title she refused to accept but could not overturn. Anne was undone in a matter of weeks, through an accusation whose speed and severity suggests it was less a genuine legal process than a predetermined conclusion. Both women, in their own ways, discovered that being married to Henry meant that a woman's security depended entirely on producing a living son, and that no amount of intelligence, conviction, or personal strength could fully protect against the consequences of failing to do so. Within 24 hours of Anne's execution, Henry was betrothed to a woman who had been quietly waiting in the wings for some time, a woman whose entire public presentation stood in deliberate, almost pointed contrast to everything Anne had represented. Jane Seymour had been serving as a lady-in-waiting at court since the late 1520s, first under Catherine of Aragon, and later under Anne Boleyn herself. She came from a respectable, but not especially prominent gentry family in Wiltshire, and by the time Henry's attention turned toward her in early 1536, she was already in her mid to late 20s, considered by the standards of the time to be approaching the outer edge of typical marriageable age. Where Anne had been known for her quick wit, her confidence, and her willingness to argue and challenge, Jane Seymour was known for her cool, calculating, and often deceptive approach to life. She was a woman of 25 years of age, with a long, Contemporary accounts describe Jane as quiet, modest, and notably reserved. Some historians have suggested that this contrast was not entirely accidental, that Jane and her ambitious family, including her brothers Edward and Thomas Seymour, may have deliberately cultivated a public image calculated to appeal to a king who had grown tired of a wife too willing to speak her own mind. Whether Jane's quietness reflected her genuine temperament, a careful strategy, or some combination of both, is something the surviving evidence cannot fully settle. What is clear is that Henry, in the final weeks of Anne's life, was already receiving letters and gifts from Jane, conducted with a modesty that seemed expressly designed to distinguish her from her predecessor, including one occasion on which she reportedly returned a purse of money Henry had sent her, along with a message asking him to understand that she had no fortune in the world but her honor, and would rather die 1,000 deaths than compromise it. Henry and Jane married on the 30th of May, 1536, just 11 days after Anne's execution, in a private ceremony at Whitehall Palace. The speed of this union shocked many observers, even at the time, though for Henry, the underlying logic was consistent with everything that had come before. He needed a son. He had removed the wife who had failed twice to provide one, and he intended to move toward that goal without delay. Jane's approach to queenship, from the very beginning, was markedly different from Anne's. She avoided political controversy, showed no interest in influencing matters of church reform, and appears to have understood her role largely in terms of restoring a sense of stability and traditional order to the court after the turbulence of the preceding several years. One of her few recorded political interventions came in 1536, when she is said to have knelt before Henry to plead for leniency toward the participants of the Pilgrimage of Grace, a major popular uprising in northern England, provoked partly by opposition to Henry's religious reforms. Henry reportedly reminded her, in response, of what had happened to his previous wife when she involved herself too directly in matters of state, a chilling remark that suggests Jane understood exactly how narrow the boundaries of her influence were expected to remain. She also took a quiet but meaningful interest in reconciling Henry with his estranged elder daughter, Mary, who had been treated harshly and kept apart from her father in the years following Catherine's fall from favour and Anne's rise. Jane is credited with helping to soften this estrangement, encouraging a partial reconciliation between Henry and Mary during her time as queen, an act that suggests a genuine kindness underlying her carefully controlled public presentation. In October 1537, more than a year into the marriage, Jane finally gave Henry what none of his previous wives had been able to provide. She gave birth to a son named Edward at Hampton Court Palace. The celebrations across England were reported to be enormous, with bonfires lit and church bells rung throughout London and beyond, a public outpouring of relief that reflected just how heavily the question of succession had weighed on the entire kingdom for more than a decade. The birth itself, however, was difficult and prolonged, lasting, according to some accounts, nearly 3 days. Jane's health deteriorated rapidly in the days that followed. What exactly went wrong remains somewhat uncertain from the surviving medical descriptions of the period, though modern historians generally believe she suffered from a postpartum infection, possibly related to retained placental tissue, a condition that eluded the medical understanding and treatment available at the time. She died on the 24th of October, 1537, 12 days after giving birth to the son the entire kingdom had been waiting for. Henry's grief at Jane's death appears, by most accounts, to have been genuine and considerable. He withdrew from court for a period, and in the years that followed, he would repeatedly describe her, in conversations recorded by those around him, as his true wife, the one who had given him what the others could not. When he died a decade later, he chose to be buried beside her at St. George's Chapel in Windsor, a choice that stands as its own kind of testimony, made among 5 other possible resting places and 5 other marriages. There is something worth noticing in this outcome, something the flattened rhyme of divorced, beheaded, died tends to obscure. Jane Seymour is often remembered as the wife who succeeded where the others failed, the one Henry loved best, the one who gave him a son. But her success came at the cost of her own life, and it rested on a role so narrow and so carefully managed that it left almost no room for her to exist as anything beyond the function she performed. She had watched what happened to a queen who spoke her mind too freely. She had built her entire brief queenship around not repeating that mistake. And she died before she ever had the chance to discover what her life might have looked like once the son had been born, and the immediate purpose of her marriage fulfilled. Edward, the infant son whose birth had cost his mother her life, was not yet 2 years old when Henry's ministers began searching once again for a 4th wife. This time, the search was conducted with an unusually strong emphasis on foreign diplomacy, since Henry's advisors, led at this point by Thomas Cromwell, believed that a marriage alliance with a Protestant German territory could provide useful protection against the possibility of a combined Catholic alliance forming against England on the continent. The candidate eventually selected was Anne of Cleves, sister of the Duke of Cleves, a territory in what is now Western Germany. Very little about her early life survives in detail, but she appears to have been raised in a household that emphasized domestic skills such as needlework over the kind of courtly education in music, dancing, and foreign languages that had shaped Anne Boleyn's upbringing. This difference would matter a great deal once she arrived in England, where the entire court operated according to conventions she had simply never been trained to navigate. Before agreeing to the match, Henry, characteristically cautious about entering into another marriage site unseen, commissioned the court painter Hans Holbein the Younger to travel to Cleves and produce a portrait of Anne, so that Henry could judge her appearance before committing to the arrangement. The portrait Holbein returned with, which survives today, shows a calm, composed young woman in elaborate German dress. And by most accounts, Henry found the image pleasing enough to proceed with the marriage negotiations. Anne arrived in England at the very end of 1539, and it was here that one of the more famous and slightly uncomfortable episodes of the entire story took place. Eager to see his bride before the formal introductions could occur, and apparently caught up in the romantic conventions of chivalric literature that had shaped his own youth, Henry rode in disguise to Rochester, where Anne was staying, intending to surprise her the way a knight might surprise a lady in the old stories he had grown up reading. According to the most detailed contemporary account, written by a member of Cromwell's household, the meeting did not go as Henry had hoped. Anne, unfamiliar with this particular English courtly custom, and preoccupied with watching a bear-baiting exhibition through a window, did not immediately recognize the disguised aging king standing before her, and reportedly showed little interest in the stranger attempting to engage her attention. Henry, deeply invested in the fantasy of a romantic recognition scene, is said to have left the encounter disappointed and unsettled, It is worth pausing on this moment, because the popular version of this story usually simplifies it into a single cruel joke. The idea that Henry took one look at Anne and found her instantly and completely repulsive. The more carefully documented reality is more human and more complicated than that. What seems to have gone wrong was not primarily about Anne's appearance, but about a failed social performance. A king expecting a fairy tale recognition scene and receiving instead the polite confusion of a young woman meeting a stranger she had no reason to recognize in a country whose customs she was still learning through a language she did not yet speak fluently. Whatever the precise cause, Henry's enthusiasm for the match cooled dramatically and did not recover. He reportedly complained to Cromwell in the days before the wedding that he did not like her, that he found her unappealing in ways he struggled to fully articulate. But by that point, the diplomatic and political machinery around the marriage had progressed too far to easily reverse without serious international consequences. The wedding proceeded on the 6th of January, 1540, at Greenwich, though by all accounts it was conducted without the warmth or enthusiasm that had marked several of Henry's previous marriages. The marriage itself was brief and appears never to have been consummated. Henry confided to his physicians and to Cromwell that he found himself unable to perform his marital obligations with Anne, offering various explanations for this difficulty that historians have puzzled over ever since. Meanwhile, the broader political situation that had originally motivated the alliance with Cleves had shifted considerably, as the feared Catholic coalition on the continent that Cromwell had hoped to guard against failed to materialize, removing much of the strategic justification for the marriage in the first place. By June of 1540, Henry's ministers had begun quietly investigating whether the marriage could be annulled. What followed reveals a great deal about Anne of Cleves, that the popular telling of her story, which usually treats her as a passive and somewhat comic footnote, tends to overlook entirely. When approached about the possibility of annulment, Anne did not resist, argue, or attempt to fight for her position, the way Catherine of Aragon had fought for nearly a decade. Instead, she cooperated fully and immediately, agreeing that the marriage had never been consummated and consenting to the annulment without visible protest. Her reward for this cooperation was, by the standards of the previous marriages, extraordinarily generous. The annulment was finalized in July 1540, and Henry granted her a substantial settlement, including several properties, among them Richmond Palace and Heir Castle, the very estate where Anne Boleyn had spent part of her childhood. She was given the title of the king's beloved sister, an honorary status that placed her remarkably above every other woman at court except the Queen herself. She was invited to remain in England rather than return to Cleves, and she accepted, choosing to build a new life in the country she had originally come to only as a bride. What followed for Anne of Cleves was, by a wide margin, the most stable and comfortable outcome of any of Henry's 6 marriages. She maintained a cordial, and by some accounts, genuinely warm relationship with Henry for the remainder of his life, was received at court on friendly terms, and appears to have developed real affection for his children, particularly the 2 daughters, Mary and Elizabeth. She lived quietly and independently on her English estates for the rest of her life, managing her own household and finances with what surviving records suggest was considerable competence, and she outlived every other one of Henry's wives, dying in 1557, nearly a decade after Henry himself. There is a version of this story that treats Anne of Cleves as history's punchline. The wife Henry found unattractive, quickly discarded, and briefly amusing to a court eager to gossip about the king's discomfort. But look at what actually happened to her, set against the fates of the women who came before and after. She left a marriage she had entered through no wish of her own, retained her freedom, her wealth, her independence, and her life, and appears to have genuinely enjoyed the decades that followed. Of the 6 women in this story, she may well have built the life closest to contentment, precisely because she was released from the role rather than consumed by it. The woman who replaced her could not have arrived at that same position through more different circumstances, or come to a more different end. Catherine Howard was, by most estimates, only about 17 years old when she caught Henry's attention in the spring of 1540, while the annulment from Anne of Cleves was still being finalized. She was a first cousin of Anne Boleyn, both women descending from the powerful and ambitious Howard family, headed at this point by the same Duke of Norfolk, who had presided over Anne Boleyn's trial only 4 years earlier. Catherine had been raised largely in the household of her step-grandmother, the Dowager Duchess of Norfolk, in an environment that appears, based on testimony later gathered during the investigations into her conduct, to have been considerably less supervised than was typical for a young noblewoman of her rank. Henry, now approaching 50, in declining health, increasingly overweight, and suffering from a chronically ulcerated leg wound that never properly healed, appears to have found in Catherine's youth and vivacity something that restored, at least temporarily, a sense of his own vigor. The couple married on the 28th of July, 1540, the very same day that Thomas Cromwell, the minister who had engineered the Cleves marriage and fallen from favor in its aftermath, was executed. A grim coincidence that marked the tonal shift of this new chapter of Henry's life. Contemporary accounts describe Henry as besotted with his young wife during the early months of their marriage, showering her with gifts and affection, and referring to her at one point as his rose without a thorn. But the household environment Catherine had come from, less carefully supervised than most, appears to have included relationships from before her marriage that would eventually resurface with devastating consequences. Testimony gathered later suggested that, as a teenager, Catherine had been involved in physical relationships with at least 2 men prior to her marriage to Henry, a music teacher named Henry Mannix, and a young man named Francis Derham, who had reportedly referred to Catherine as his wife, in the informal sense sometimes used for pre-contracted couples of the period. More seriously, once she became queen, evidence suggests that Catherine began a private relationship with a courtier named Thomas Culpeper, a favourite of Henry's own privy chamber, conducted through secret meetings arranged with the help of one of her ladies-in-waiting. Whether this relationship was ever physically consummated remains debated among historians, though the surviving letters between Catherine and Culpeper, including one in which she writes that it makes her heart die to think she cannot always be in his company, suggest an emotional intimacy that was, at minimum, extraordinarily dangerous for a queen to pursue. The full scope of Catherine's earlier and current relationships came to light in the autumn of 1541, when information reached Archbishop Cranmer, who passed it to Henry in a written note rather than raising it verbally, apparently unwilling to risk the king's immediate reaction. Henry initially refused to believe the allegations, but a subsequent investigation, including testimony extracted from Mannix, Derham, and eventually Culpeper himself, confirmed enough of the story to convince Henry that his young wife had deceived him. Culpeper and Derham were executed in December 1541. Culpeper granted the comparative mercy of beheading, while Derham, convicted additionally of treason, suffered the far more brutal punishment reserved for that crime. Catherine herself was moved to Sion Abbey, while Parliament passed a bill of attainder against her, a legal mechanism that allowed for her execution without the formality of a full trial. She was taken to the Tower of London in early February 1542 and executed there on the 13th of that month, still likely only around 19 years old. Contemporary accounts describe her as composed on the scaffold, though one persistent story, whose accuracy cannot be fully verified, claims that in the days before her death, she asked for the block to be brought to her cell so she could practice how to lay her head upon it. A detail that, whether precisely true or not, captures something of the terror of a teenager facing an execution she likely never fully understood was coming until very late in the process. She was buried near her cousin, Anne Boleyn, in the same chapel within the Tower grounds. Two women from the same ambitious family, joined in death within feet of one another, having met remarkably similar ends less than 6 years apart. It is difficult to look closely at Catherine Howard's story without noticing how differently she has been remembered compared to the others. Catherine of Aragon is remembered for her dignity. Anne Boleyn is remembered for her wit and her fall. Catherine Howard is too often remembered simply as foolish, or worse, dismissed as merely promiscuous, a judgment that says more about the centuries of moralizing applied to her story than it does about the actual facts of her life. She was a teenager, raised in a chaotic household, thrust into a marriage with a man 3 decades her senior, ailing and increasingly unpredictable in temperament, and placed into a court environment where the consequences of any misstep, real or perceived, could be fatal. Whatever choices she made them without the education, the family protection, or the political standing that had given Catherine of Aragon the strength to resist for a decade, or the family influence that had helped Anne Boleyn wait 7 years before finally becoming queen. She had almost none of these advantages, and she paid for her mistakes, and perhaps for mistakes that were not entirely her own, with her life before she had reached the age of 20. Henry, by the time of Catherine Howard's execution in early 1542, had grown into a very different man from the athletic young king who had married Catherine of Aragon more than 3 decades earlier. He was now approaching his 51st year, severely overweight, in near constant pain from the ulcerated leg wound that plagued the remainder of his life, and increasingly prone to volatile and unpredictable moods that those around him had learned to navigate with real caution. It is against this backdrop, a court shaped by a king who was by now both physically diminished and emotionally unstable, that his 6th and final wife entered his life. Katherine Parr was, in almost every respect, unlike any of the women who had come before her. She was around 30 years old at the time of her marriage to Henry in 1543, and she had already been widowed twice. First from an elderly landowner named Edward Burrough, and later from John Neville, Baron Latimer, a marriage that had placed her in the middle of considerable danger during the Pilgrimage of Grace uprising of 1536, when rebels briefly held Latimer's castle and, by some accounts, took Catherine and her stepchildren hostage for a period. She had, by the time she caught Henry's attention, already lived through more genuine hardship and responsibility than most women at court twice her age. She was also, notably, already in love with someone else when Henry began courting her. Thomas Seymour, brother of the late Jane Seymour, had been pursuing Catherine before Henry's interest intervened, and Catherine appears, based on her own later writings, to have genuinely wished to marry him rather than the king. But refusing a proposal from Henry VIII was not a realistic option available to a woman in her position, and she accepted, later describing in a letter the sense that she had set aside her own wishes to submit to what she understood as God's will, a phrase that suggests real personal sacrifice underneath the formal language of duty. Whatever reluctance shaped the beginning of the marriage, Catherine brought to the role a combination of intellectual seriousness and personal warmth that had a genuinely stabilizing effect on Henry's fractured household. She took a sincere and active interest in religious scholarship, corresponding with reform-minded theologians, and eventually publishing her own devotional writing, including a work called Prayers or Meditations in 1545, making her the first woman to publish a book in English under her own name, a genuinely remarkable achievement for the period. She later wrote a more theologically daring work, The Lamentation of a Sinner, though it was prudently held back from publication until after Henry's death, since its openly reform-minded religious content would have carried real risk, while the more conservative factions at court still held influence over the aging king. Beyond her scholarship, Catherine's most lasting achievement may have been the way she reassembled Henry's fractured family. She took a genuine and active interest in all three of his children, Mary, Elizabeth, and the young Edward, encouraging their education, corresponding warmly with each of them, and helping to arrange the household conditions that eventually led, in 1544, to the passage of an Act of Parliament restoring both Mary and Elizabeth to the line of succession, positions from which they had previously been formally excluded following their mothers' respective falls from grace. It is worth pausing on this. The very existence of the later reigns of Mary I and Elizabeth I, two of the most consequential rulers in English history, rests in part on a legal and diplomatic groundwork laid during Katherine Parr's tenure as Queen, a legacy that reaches far beyond the boundaries of her own brief marriage. Her position was not without genuine danger, however. In 1546, conservative factions at court, alarmed by her outspoken interest in religious reform and her willingness to debate theology directly with Henry himself, attempted to turn the king against her, drafting articles of accusation that, had they succeeded, might well have led to her arrest and a possible execution, echoing the fates of two of her predecessors. According to a story recorded by the martyrologist John Fox some years later, Catherine learned of the plot in time, fell ill with what may have been genuine distress, and upon recovering, went to Henry and carefully reframed her theological conversations with him as attempts to distract him from his physical pain and to learn from his superior wisdom, rather than genuine attempts to instruct or challenge him. Henry, satisfied by this display of submission, reportedly reconciled with her on the spot, and when officers arrived the following day to arrest her, he angrily sent them away. Whether every detail of this account is precisely accurate cannot be fully confirmed, but the broader pattern it reflects, a court where even the most capable and beloved of Henry's wives lived under the constant threat of a single accusation turning fatal, rings true to everything else we know about these years. Henry died on the 28th of January, 1547, at Whitehall Palace, with Catherine having nursed him through the final painful months of his declining health. She did not attend his funeral, in keeping with the conventions of the period, which did not typically include widowed queens in such ceremonies. And she was, for a brief period afterward, finally free to make her own choices for the first time in years. She married Thomas Seymour within months of Henry's death, the very man she had wished to marry years earlier before Henry's interest had intervened. A decision that scandalized the court, given how quickly it followed the king's death, but one that seems to have brought her a period of genuine personal happiness after decades of duty and danger. She became pregnant for the first time in her life at around 35 years old and gave birth to a daughter, Mary, in the summer of 1548. But childbirth in this period remained perilous, regardless of a woman's rank or resources, and Catherine developed a fever in the days that followed, likely the same kind of postpartum infection that had killed Jane Seymour a decade earlier. She died on the 5th of September, 1548, only days after finally becoming a mother, the last of Henry's 6 wives to die. And in some ways, the one whose ending most closely echoed where this story began, since a fever following childbirth had ended Catherine's life in almost exactly the way it had so nearly ended Catherine of Aragon's mother's own labours. A quiet, unglamorous danger that shadowed the lives of women across every level of society during this period, regardless of crown or title. Standing back now from these 6 individual lives, laid out one after another across nearly 4 decades, it becomes possible to see something that the familiar rhyme obscures rather than reveals. Divorced, beheaded, died. Divorced, beheaded, survived. It is compact and memorable, and it is also almost nothing like the truth. Catherine of Aragon fought her case for years with a legal and theological seriousness that helped trigger the English Reformation itself. Anne Boleyn waited 7 years and reshaped a nation's religious identity before losing her life in a trial most historians now regard as unjust. Jane Seymour achieved everything the entire kingdom demanded of her and died from it within days. Anne of Cleves, so often treated as the story's punchline, quietly built the most independent and contented life of any of the 6. Catherine Howard, a teenager without protection or preparation, paid with her life for choices made in circumstances she never fully controlled. And Katherine Parr, twice widowed before she ever met Henry, became one of the first published female authors in the English language, helped restore 2 future queens to their place in the succession, and died in the end from the same ordinary danger of childbirth that claimed so many women of her era who never wore a crown at all. Henry moves through all 6 of these stories, and it would be dishonest to pretend his presence was incidental. His need for a male heir, his volatile temperament, his capacity for both genuine affection and sudden, brutal reversal, shaped the outer boundaries of what each of these women's lives could become. But within those boundaries, each of them was still, unmistakably, herself. Or Catherine's stubborn conviction, Anne's quick intelligence and nerve, Jane's careful restraint, Anne of Cleves's practical composure, Catherine Howard's youth and vulnerability, Katherine Parr's scholarship and quiet courage. 6 different women, 6 different educations, 6 different countries and households and private sorrows, all of them folded by the accident of history into a single sentence that has outlived almost everything else we remember about them. Perhaps the truest way to hold this story is simply to let each of them keep her own shape a little longer than the rhyme allows. Not 6 wives, but 6 lives, each one complete in itself, each one carrying its own private weather of hope and disappointment and endurance, long before any of them ever became a wife to a king at all. If there is another life you would like to hear told this way, some evening, you are welcome to leave the name below. For now, let the story rest. Good night.